My name is Audrey, 33 years old, and my husband recently looked me in the eye and told me I did not belong in his world anymore. I agreed to everything. 5 days later, his lawyer called him, his voice shaking so hard it echoed through the phone. The office building, the development properties, the mansion, none of it was his. My husband froze. He finally understood what he had never bothered to ask me. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to let an arrogant person dig their own grave. Trust me, you will want to hear exactly how this unfolds. The lighting inside the Michelin-starred restaurant downtown was perfectly dim, casting a warm, golden glow over the crystal wine glasses. We were at our usual corner booth, the one Preston demanded we reserve weeks in advance to prove his status. He sat across from me wearing a bespoke navy suit that cost more than my first car. He was swirling a glass of Cabernet, looking entirely too pleased with himself. I wore a simple black dress, the kind he always criticized for being too boring for the wife of a rising commercial real estate developer. I thought we were celebrating his latest acquisition, but the mood felt clinical. Preston set his wine glass down, reached into his tailored jacket, and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He did not say a word. He just slid it across the smooth linen of the table. Then he placed a personal check on top. I glanced down. The check was made out to me for $10,000. The memo line was blank. I looked back up at him. His handsome face was devoid of emotion. It was the face of a man making a corporate transaction. "Go ahead and open it," he said, his tone flat and businesslike. I did not touch the envelope. I knew exactly what it was. The heavy cream paper, the embossed logo of his high-priced legal team. It was a divorce petition. "You are a good woman," Audrey Preston began, crossing his arms. "But my career is taking off in a way you cannot keep up with. I am closing a $500 million commercial project next month. I am entering a new tax bracket, a new social circle. I need a powerhouse partner by my side. Someone who understands the game, someone who builds empires, not a freelance bookkeeper who spends her days crunching numbers for local bakeries." I stared at him, letting his words hang in the quiet air. A waiter walked by, oblivious to the fact that my entire marriage was dissolving over a plate of seared scallops. "I am giving you $10,000 to help you get situated," Preston continued, gesturing lazily toward the check, as if bestowing a grand charitable donation. "The papers state that I keep the primary assets, including the business and the Oak Cliff mansion. You know you could never afford the upkeep on that house anyway. You have 5 days to pack your things and vacate the property. I will have my assistant send you a list of affordable apartments." 5 days. He was giving me 5 days to leave the sprawling estate we had lived in for years. He looked incredibly smug. He genuinely believed he held all the cards. He thought he was banishing the peasant wife back to the village. He expected me to cry, beg, or cause a scene. He braced for a hysterical reaction. Instead, I reached out and picked up the check. $10,000. A parting gift for the woman he thought was nothing more than a glorified calculator. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice entirely steady. "Are you absolutely sure about this, Preston?" "I have never been more sure of anything in my life," he replied coldly. "Sign the papers, Audrey. Do not make this harder than it has to be. Take the money and go find a life that fits you." I gave him a very small, perfectly polite smile. I picked up the expensive pen. I did not read the terms. I simply signed my name on the dotted line. He had no idea what he had just done. I slid the signed documents back across the table. I stood up and smoothed out my dress. "I will be out of the Oak Cliff mansion in 5 days," I told him calmly. "Enjoy your new empire, Preston." I turned and walked out. He thought he had just won the game. He did not realize the board he was playing on belonged entirely to me. As I took my first steps away from the table, my heels clicking softly against the polished hardwood floor, a sudden voice cut through the low murmur of the restaurant. "Leaving so soon, Audrey? You forgot something." I paused and turned around. Sienna was standing blocking my path to the exit. She was 28 years old, the daughter of a major private equity investor, and currently serving as a vice president at her father's firm. She held a perfectly chilled martini in one hand, the olive resting against the delicate crystal glass. She was draped in a silk slip dress that clung to her in all the right places, exuding an air of old money confidence that was entirely unearned. Preston had not even waited for me to leave the building before signaling his mistress to approach the table. He remained seated in the booth behind her, watching the confrontation with a faint smirk on his face. He wanted an audience. He wanted to watch the two women in his life establish the new hierarchy. I looked down at Sienna. What did I forget, Sienna? She took a slow sip of her drink, letting her gaze travel up and down my simple black dress. Her lips curled into a sneer of absolute pity. First of all, you forgot to dress for the occasion, she said smoothly, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure the nearby tables could hear. This is a Michelin-starred establishment, Audrey, not a neighborhood bake sale. I am surprised they even let you pass the host stand wearing something straight off a discount rack. I felt a flicker of amusement, but I kept my face perfectly blank. My dress was a custom-tailored piece I had commissioned from an independent designer in Milan, completely devoid of the flashy logos Sienna relied on to prove her worth. But I was not going to explain stealth wealth to a woman whose entire identity was funded by her father. Is that all you wanted to tell me? I asked calmly. Sienna stepped closer, invading my personal space. The smell of her expensive floral perfume was overwhelming. No, she whispered, her eyes flashing with malice. I wanted to make sure you understood the timeline. Preston and I are moving into the Oak Cliff mansion on the 1st of the month. We are hosting an engagement party soon after, and I absolutely refuse to live in a house that smells like cheap cooking and mediocrity. She reached into her designer clutch and pulled out a small neon yellow business card. She flicked her wrist, tossing the card right against my chest. It fluttered down and landed on the floor near my shoes. I glanced down at it. It was an advertisement for a budget residential cleaning service. Do me a favor, Audrey. Sienna continued, her tone dripping with condescension. Call them. Or better yet, grab a bucket and scrub the hardwood floors yourself before you pack your cheap bags. I want every trace of you completely sanitized from that house. Preston needs a fresh start with a woman who actually matches his ambitions. Behind her, Preston raised his glass of Cabernet in a silent toast, backing up her insults. They were a matching set of arrogant fools, drunk on their own perceived power. They expected me to shatter right there in the middle of the dining room. They wanted tears screaming or a desperate plea for dignity. Instead, I let out a soft, genuine laugh. It was a short, breathy sound that immediately wiped the smirk off Sienna's face. I looked back down at the cheap neon business card on the floor, then up at Sienna's perfectly contoured face. You want the floors scrubbed, I clarified, keeping my voice light and conversational. Spotless. Sienna snapped clearly, agitated that I was not crying. I nodded thoughtfully. Good to know. I always appreciate tenants who care about property maintenance. Be sure to use the approved hardwood cleaner. The wood was imported from France, and harsh chemicals will ruin the finish. Sienna frowned confusion, wrinkling her forehead. What are you talking about? I did not elaborate. I simply stepped around her, leaving the cheap neon card sitting on the floor where she threw it. Enjoy your evening, Sienna. Congratulations on the promotion to housewife. I calmly continued walking toward the exit doors, my posture perfectly straight. I could feel their eyes burning into my back as I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the cool evening air. They thought they had humiliated me. They thought they had secured their glamorous future in my home. I pulled my phone from my purse, a genuine smile finally breaking across my face. Let them gloat for now. The countdown had officially started. 3 days later, the cavernous foyer of the Oak Cliff mansion echoed with the sharp snap of packing tape. I knelt on the imported rug, carefully folding my clothes into a stack of cardboard boxes. The house was a sprawling testament to the image Preston desperately wanted to project, featuring vaulted ceilings, marble columns, and a sweeping grand staircase. but to me it had just been a quiet place to work. Patricia, my soon-to-be ex-mother-in-law, hovered over me like a vulture waiting for its next meal. She wore a tailored tweed suit and clutched a clipboard, treating my departure like an audit. Every time I placed an item into a box, her sharp eyes darted toward it, searching for any excuse to accuse me of theft. "Make sure you only pack the clothes you brought into this marriage. Audrey," Patricia barked, her voice echoing off the high walls. Preston was very clear. "The antique vases, the silver cutlery, and the artwork stay here. Sienna has already hired an interior decorator to modernize the space, but the family heirlooms belong to the bloodline. I will not have you sneaking out with things you have no right to claim." I did not bother looking up. I smoothly placed a stack of sweaters into the box. "I assure you, Patricia, I have zero interest in your silver cutlery. I am only taking my personal belongings and my business files." She scoffed loudly, crossing her arms tightly. "Business files? Please, you mean your little bookkeeping receipts? It is a miracle Preston put up with your lack of ambition for as long as he did. Sienna is already helping him secure investors for the Crown Plaza project. That is what a real wife does. She elevates her husband. She does not drag him down to the middle class." I taped the box shut and dragged it toward the front door. Before Patricia could launch into another tirade about her beloved son, a shadow fell over the entryway. "I do not think Audrey needs a lecture on ambition, Patricia." I looked up to see Jasmine leaning casually against the arched doorframe of the living room. Jasmine was 32 years old, an African-American powerhouse who worked as a senior corporate lawyer at one of the top firms in the city. She was married to Preston's older brother, Colin, but unlike the rest of the family, Jasmine actually possessed a spine and a functioning moral compass. She looked impeccable in a sharp charcoal blazer and tailored trousers, holding a cup of coffee and observing the scene with deep amusement. Patricia stiffened, clearly intimidated by her successful daughter-in-law. "Jasmine, what are you doing here? You should be at the firm. And you should be helping us make sure this woman does not rob us blind." Jasmine took a slow sip of her coffee, her dark eyes locking onto Patricia with freezing precision. "I am on my lunch break. And considering Audrey makes her own money, I seriously doubt she wants your dusty heirlooms. Leave her alone. She is complying with the agreement." Patricia huffed, her face turning a blotchy shade of red. "You always take her side. You have no idea what it takes to protect family assets." "I think I know exactly how assets work," Patricia Jasmine replied smoothly, brushing a piece of lint off her lapel. "Now why do you not go to the kitchen and count your spoons? I want to say goodbye to my sister-in-law in peace." Patricia glared at both of us, clutching her clipboard tightly before storming off down the hall, her heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor. Once she was out of earshot, Jasmine walked over and looked down at my meager stack of cardboard boxes. Then she looked around the massive, luxurious living room. A small, knowing smile played on her lips. She knelt down next to me, her voice dropping to a low whisper so the echoing walls would not carry the sound. "I saw the master lease agreement cross my desk at the firm yesterday, Audrey. The one Preston is begging to sign for that massive new commercial development plot." I paused my packing and met her gaze. I did not say a word, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. Jasmine chuckled softly, shaking her head in sheer disbelief. "He really has no idea what he just poked, does he?" I looked at Jasmine, appreciating the sharp legal mind that had easily connected the dots my arrogant husband was too blind to see. I quietly reached for a roll of clear packing tape, offered her a slow, deliberate wink, and went right back to sealing my cardboard boxes while waiting for the inevitable absolute downfall to soon fully unfold. By late afternoon, the moving crew had loaded the last of my cardboard boxes into their truck. The sprawling Oak Cliff mansion felt hollow and strange, stripped of the few personal touches I had brought into it. The foreman, a burly man named Dave, wiped his forehead with a rag and walked over to me holding a digital tablet. "That is everything," Miss Dave said, tapping the screen. "The total is $1,200. If you could just swipe or tap your card right here, we will get on the road and meet you at your new place." "Thank you, Dave," I replied politely. I reached into my purse and pulled out the sleek silver debit card tied to the joint checking account Preston and I had shared for 5 years. I tapped it against the screen of his tablet. A sharp, discordant beep echoed in the quiet foyer. Dave frowned, looking down at the screen. A bright red error message flashed across the digital display. "Declined," Dave muttered. He looked up at me apologetically. "Sometimes the machine is a little finicky. Let us try inserting the chip this time." I inserted the card into the reader. We waited in silence for a few seconds. Another loud beep sounded, followed by the same red error message. "Insufficient funds or account frozen." My heart did not race, but my eyes narrowed slightly. I knew exactly what the balance was in that account. We had over $80,000 sitting in liquid cash as of yesterday morning. There was no legitimate reason for a simple moving fee to bounce. "I am sorry," Miss Dave said, shifting uncomfortably on his feet. "Do you have another card you want to try?" Before I could answer him, my cell phone began to vibrate violently inside my purse. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. The caller ID flashed Preston's name. The timing was entirely too perfect to be a coincidence. "Excuse me for just one moment, Dave," I said, stepping away toward the sweeping grand staircase. I swiped the screen to answer the call and pressed the phone to my ear. "Having a little trouble settling your bill?" Audrey Preston asked. His voice was thick with amusement. I could hear the faint clinking of expensive glassware in the background. He was probably at a country club sipping scotch with Sienna while monitoring my financial humiliation in real time. "You froze the joint accounts," I stated flatly, skipping the pleasantries. "You do realize that is entirely illegal during a pending divorce without a court order, right?" Preston let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Oh, please. You are a glorified calculator. Do not try to lecture me on the law. I am protecting my assets from a disgruntled soon-to-be ex-wife. I saw the pending charge for the moving company and decided I was not going to subsidize your departure. You literally ordered me to leave the house in 5 days," I reminded him, keeping my voice perfectly level. "And you can leave," Preston shot back, his tone turning vicious. "But you are going to do it on your own dime. It is time you woke up to reality, Audrey. You wanted to play the dutiful, quiet wife, but you brought absolutely nothing to the table. Let us see how far your bookkeeping pennies get you in the real world. Call your cheap friends, ask for a loan. I am cutting you off completely. Welcome to the bottom rung of the ladder." He hung up the phone before I could respond. The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone, staring at the darkened screen. Preston really thought he had orchestrated the perfect checkmate. He believed I was standing in the foyer of his mansion, utterly humiliated, begging the movers for mercy because I could not afford $1,200. I turned back to Dave, who was politely pretending to examine the floor. "I apologize for the delay, Dave," I said smoothly, walking back over to him. "It seems my ex-husband has decided to play a foolish financial game." "I am really sorry to hear that," Miss Dave said sympathetically. "Look, we can bill you. You can call the office tomorrow." "That will not be necessary," I replied. I opened my purse again and reached into a hidden zippered compartment. I bypassed the useless silver debit card and pulled out something entirely different. It was a heavy, matte, black, titanium card. The exclusive Centurion card. There was no personal name printed on the front, just 2 words elegantly engraved in silver lettering: Apex Holdings. I handed the heavy metal card to Dave. He blinked, clearly surprised by the sheer weight of it, and slid it into the reader. Transaction approved instantly. While Dave handed me the printed receipt with a respectful nod, completely unaware of the financial empire resting in the palm of my hand, my soon-to-be ex-husband was busy building his own imaginary kingdom on live television. Across town, inside the brightly lit studios of the local business news network, Preston sat in a plush leather armchair. He was the featured guest on the morning financial segment, a spot he had undoubtedly paid a public relations firm heavily to secure. The chyrons at the bottom of the screen flashed his name in bold letters, labeling him as the city's premier visionary commercial developer. The interviewer, an older man with silver hair and a sharp suit, leaned forward enthusiastically. "Preston, let us talk about the Crown Plaza. This is not just another office building. We are looking at a $500 million mixed-use development, luxury retail high-end corporate suites, and premium residential spaces. Some analysts say it is the most ambitious project this city has seen in a decade. How does a developer at 35 pull off something of this magnitude? Preston flashed his signature charming smile, adjusting his silk tie. It takes relentless drive, Tom. You cannot build an empire by playing it safe or surrounding yourself with small-minded people. You have to be willing to cut dead weight both in business and in life to reach the next level. I have always believed in surrounding myself with powerhouse partners who share my vision for absolute dominance in the market. I watched this broadcast later on my phone, sitting comfortably in my temporary luxury condo, sipping green tea. Hearing him subtly reference our divorce and refer to me as dead weight on local television would have crushed the old me. Now it only made his impending downfall that much sweeter. The interviewer nodded solemnly, completely, buying into Preston's carefully crafted persona. And the location, Preston? You chose the absolute prime commercial acreage right in the heart of the downtown business district. Securing that land must have been a monumental battle. Did you purchase the lots outright from the city? Preston let out a condescending chuckle, crossing one leg over the other. Not at all, Tom. Buying the land outright is an amateur move that ties up too much liquid capital. A true visionary knows how to leverage assets. We are executing a 99-year master lease. We maintain full developmental control of the dirt, build the Crown Plaza, and reap the massive profits, all while keeping our overhead incredibly streamlined. A master lease of that size is rare, the interviewer noted, looking impressed. Who owns the underlying land? A family trust or a corporate conglomerate? Preston waved his hand dismissively, his arrogance rolling off him in waves. Just some faceless private equity firm. Apex Holdings. They are a quiet group, mostly paper pushers who manage legacy assets and blind trusts. They lack the operational capacity to develop the land themselves, so they are desperate to hand it over to a real player like me. They just sit back and collect a modest rent check while I do the heavy lifting and change the skyline. He spoke about Apex Holdings with such profound disrespect, completely unaware that the faceless private equity firm he was insulting was entirely owned and operated by the woman he had just kicked out of his house. The master lease agreement is sitting on my desk right now, Preston bragged to the camera, leaning toward the lens, as if addressing his competitors directly. We are finalizing a few standard administrative details, but I will be signing the execution copy by the end of the week. Once my ink hits that paper, the Crown Plaza is officially born, and Apex Holdings will be lucky to have their name buried somewhere in the fine print of my success story. The interviewer beamed. Incredible confidence, Preston. We expect nothing less from you. We will be watching the groundbreaking ceremony closely. Preston smiled brightly, basking in the validation he so desperately craved. He thought he had outsmarted the entire real estate market. He truly believed he had leveraged a sleepy holding company into handing him the keys to a $500 million kingdom. He was publicly staking his entire reputation, his company's future, and his massive construction loans on a contract he assumed was a guaranteed win. He had no idea that the ink he was so eager to put on that paper was about to sign his own execution warrant. By going on television and publicly tying his net worth to the Crown Plaza, he painted a target on his back. And I, the small-minded bookkeeper he had so easily discarded, simply kept my finger resting patiently on the trigger. The television screen faded to a commercial break just as a soft chime echoed through my temporary residence. I was staying in a penthouse suite at the Grandview Point Luxury Condominiums, a property fully owned by one of my subsidiary companies. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, unobstructed view of the very downtown skyline my soon-to-be ex-husband was currently bragging about on live television. I muted the TV and walked over to the heavy front door. My private concierge, a polite young man named David, was standing in the hallway holding a flat cardboard box. The box was wrapped in glossy silver paper and had a massive, obnoxious pink bow stuck to the top. This was dropped off downstairs by a private courier a few minutes ago, Miss Audrey, David said, holding out the box respectfully. The courier said it was highly urgent and required immediate delivery to your hands. Thank you, David, I replied, taking the lightweight package. I closed the heavy oak door and carried the box over to my marble kitchen island. There was no return address on the silver wrapping paper, but I already had a very strong suspicion about the sender. The excessive use of pink ribbon was a dead giveaway. I pulled a sleek letter opener from the drawer and sliced through the thick, clear tape. Inside the box, nestled beneath layers of unnecessarily expensive tissue paper, was a folded garment. I reached in and pulled out a piece of rough, scratchy blue fabric, holding it up to the natural light streaming through the windows. It was a standard-issue industrial janitor uniform, the exact kind you buy in bulk from a discount supply catalog. Pinned to the front pocket was a cheap plastic name tag with the word trainee clumsily written on it in thick black permanent marker. Tucked beneath the stiff collar was a thick cream-colored envelope. I opened it and pulled out a heavy card written in looping, pretentious calligraphy. The note read, "Audrey, I know. Finding a job with zero real skills can be terrifying. I asked my father to see if his building management company had any openings for someone of your background. They are always looking for people to scrub toilets on the night shift. Wear this to your interview. Consider it my first charitable act as the new lady of the Oak Cliff Mansion. Best, Sienna." I stood in the quiet luxury of my penthouse, holding the cheap blue polyester uniform in one hand and the malicious note in the other. For a brief second, the sheer audacity of the gesture hung in the air. Sienna had actually paid a private courier to rush deliver a janitor uniform to insult a woman she genuinely believed was utterly destitute. "Find your new place in society and stay out of ours," she had scribbled at the very bottom of the card. Then I started to laugh. It was not a bitter laugh. It was a deep, genuine sound of pure amusement that echoed off the high ceilings of the condo. They were so predictable. They were so utterly consumed by their own superficial metrics of success that they could not fathom a world where wealth did not loudly announce itself with flashy logos and public boasting. They thought kicking me while I was down was a victory, completely oblivious to the actual reality around them. I tossed the cheap blue uniform directly into the stainless steel trash can. I kept the handwritten note, placing it neatly in a folder on the counter. It would serve as an excellent souvenir when this was all over. It was time to get to work. I walked over to the modern glass desk positioned near the window and opened my laptop. The screen glowed to life, illuminating the dark wood of the desk. I bypassed the standard browser and launched a highly secured encrypted application designed exclusively for my private network. A minimalist login screen appeared, displaying only a small stylized logo. I typed in my administrative credentials, verified the biometric fingerprint scanner on the keyboard, and waited for the two-factor authentication code to ping my encrypted secondary phone. Once the secure handshake was completed, the screen transitioned smoothly. "Welcome back, Director." The proprietary system displayed in crisp white lettering. I was now logged into the master administrative portal of Apex Holdings. The dashboard showed real-time valuations of billions in commercial real estate, liquid capital reserves, and active long-term leases. Right at the top of the pending approvals list was the file I had been waiting for, the Crown Plaza Master Lease Agreement, Developer Preston. I reached for my coffee, smiling. Sienna wanted me scrubbing floors. I preferred destroying arrogant empires. I clicked open the digital file for the Crown Plaza Master Lease Agreement. The document was over 200 pages long, filled with dense legal jargon outlining a 99-year commitment. Preston and his team had spent months negotiating these terms with my proxy management firm, genuinely believing they were outmaneuvering a sluggish and unaware corporate giant. They secured a favorable ground rent and extensive developmental control. It was the deal of a lifetime, the exact type of financial leverage a developer desperately needed to secure massive bank loans for construction. I picked up my phone and dialed a secure unlisted number. It rang exactly twice before a familiar, sharp voice answered. "Tell me you saw the television interview," Jasmine said, the amusement clear in her tone. "I saw it. I replied, keeping my eyes glued to the screen. He is practically begging the city to watch him sign this lease. Are the final revisions ready on your end? Jasmine, operating secretly as my lead corporate counsel, rustled some papers. I have the amended execution copy right here. I must admit, Audrey, this is brilliant. Usually, a morals clause is reserved for celebrity endorsements or executive employment contracts. Inserting a heavily fortified morals clause into a commercial real estate master lease is incredibly rare. His lawyers are going to flag this immediately. Not if we structure the ultimatum correctly, I countered softly. Preston is holding a press conference soon. He needs this lease signed by Friday to secure his $50 million construction loan. If he hesitates, the bank pulls the funding and his entire project collapses before a single shovel hits the dirt. Send the revision. Tell his legal team it is a final, non-negotiable requirement from the Apex Holdings Board of Directors. I listened to the clicking of Jasmine typing on her keyboard. The clause explicitly states that the landlord reserves the absolute right to instantly terminate the lease without cure period or financial penalty in the event the tenant or its chief executive is involved in any public scandal, documented infidelity, or actions that bring severe reputational damage to the property. If triggered, he forfeits all improvements and his entire deposit. It is a financial guillotine. Send it right now, I instructed calmly. A few seconds later, my administrative portal refreshed. The updated document was officially dispatched to Preston's legal department. I leaned back in my leather office chair, silently watching the digital tracking log continuously refresh on my computer screen. This software allowed me to monitor exactly when the document was opened, how long it was viewed, and when the digital signature was applied. For the next hour, I sat quietly reviewing other portfolio acquisitions while keeping one eye on the tracking log. At exactly 2:15 in the afternoon, the notification pinged. The document had been opened by Preston's lead attorney. I imagined the panicked phone calls happening across town. His lawyers were undoubtedly warning him about the unprecedented and aggressive clause. Any rational developer would have walked away, or at least demanded a month to negotiate the exact definitions of public scandal. But Preston was not a rational developer. He was an egomaniac high on his own supply, desperate to maintain the illusion of his unstoppable momentum. He truly believed he was invincible. Furthermore, he believed the holding company was just a group of lazy bureaucrats who would never actually monitor his personal life. 10 minutes later, the tracking log updated again. The document had been forwarded directly to Preston's private email. I held my breath, watching the blinking cursor on my screen. If he read it carefully, he might realize the danger. He might realize someone was placing a very specific, perfectly tailored noose around his neck. But I knew the man I had been married to. I knew his impatience. I knew his absolute disdain for reading fine print, a task he had always outsourced to his supposedly unambitious wife. The screen flashed green. A new notification popped up in the center of the dashboard. Document signed and executed. I let out a slow, deep breath. He did not read it. He had blindly scribbled his digital signature onto the bottom line, completely surrendering his entire corporate future to my absolute discretion. He had just handed me the legal authority to seize his most valuable asset the second his scandalous private life became public knowledge. I picked up my phone and sent a quick, single text message to Jasmine. The trap is officially set. Her reply came through a second later. Let the games begin. I closed my laptop and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city skyline. Preston genuinely thought he was the absolute king of the commercial real estate world, but he was nothing more than a blind pawn moving exactly where I wanted him to go. Barely 5 days had passed since I watched Preston blindly sign his corporate life away. I was sitting at my kitchen island, enjoying a quiet Friday morning with a cup of black coffee, when David, the ever-punctual concierge, brought up my daily mail. Among the usual stack of financial briefings and investment prospectuses was a thick, oversized envelope made of heavy, textured paper. The return address was printed in sharp gold foil. It was the address of the Oak Cliff mansion. I set my coffee mug down and picked up the envelope. The calligraphy on the front was overly elaborate, matching the pretentious style Sienna and Patricia both loved so much. I sliced through the thick wax seal on the back. I pulled out a stiff, cream-colored card with gold-beveled edges. At the top, printed in bold, elegant typography, was a formal announcement. You are cordially invited to celebrate the engagement of Preston and Sienna. I stared at the words, letting the audacity of the situation wash over me. Preston had handed me divorce papers less than 2 weeks ago. Our marriage was not legally dissolved yet, and he was already throwing a lavish engagement party with his mistress. But the true insult was printed right below their names. The venue for this grand celebration was my former home, the Oak Cliff Mansion, the very house I had been kicked out of just days prior. A smaller piece of paper fluttered out of the envelope and landed on the marble counter. It was a handwritten note from Patricia, my soon-to-be ex-mother-in-law. Her sharp cursive filled the page. Audrey, I insisted Preston send you an invitation. I think it is important for you to see what a true partnership looks like. Sienna has already transformed the house into a home fit for a successful man. Come have a drink, see what you could never provide for my son, and finally accept your new place in the world. Besides, we need you to drop off the spare garage clickers anyway. Do not bother bringing a gift, we know you cannot afford one. Patricia. I read the note twice, a slow smile spreading across my face. Patricia was trying to deliver a crushing emotional blow. She wanted me to sit in my temporary apartment crying over my lost marriage, humiliated that another woman had seamlessly taken my place in high society. She expected me to cower in shame. I picked up my phone and dialed Jasmine. She answered on the first ring, the sound of rustling legal documents in the background. Tell me you did not actually get an invitation, Jasmine said, skipping the greeting entirely. Colin mentioned something about Patricia demanding you be put on the guest list, but I told him there was no way they were actually that stupid. I am holding a gold foil invitation right now, I replied. Patricia included a note asking me to return the spare garage clickers. She wants me to see Sienna playing hostess. Jasmine let out a sharp laugh. The level of delusion in that family is a medical mystery. Are you going to ignore it? They just want an audience. If you do not show up, Patricia will tell everyone you were too heartbroken to face them. Oh, I am not going to ignore it, I said, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. I am going to RSVP, yes. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the smirk in Jasmine's voice when she finally spoke. You are going to walk into the lion's den. It is not a lion's den, Jasmine. It is my house, I reminded her softly. And I think it is incredibly rude to ignore a party being thrown on my own property. Besides, Preston needs to feel absolute confidence going into his bank meetings next week. Showing up and letting them try to humiliate me will only feed his massive ego. He will think he is completely untouchable. That is exactly where I want him, right before I pull the rug out from under his entire life. Jasmine chuckled darkly. What are you going to wear? Please tell me you are not wearing something modest just to appease them. Sienna criticized my clothes at the restaurant I noted opening my closet doors. I think it is time I stop hiding the Apex Holdings budget. I will see you at the party, Jasmine. Make sure you get a front row seat. I ended the call and gently tossed the phone onto the large bed. I walked over to my desk, picked up a heavy black fountain pen, and confidently checked the attending box on the RSVP card. It was time to get ready. The evening of the party arrived with a crisp breeze rolling off the hills. I stood in front of the full-length mirror, evaluating my reflection. For 5 years, I had purposely dressed down to make Preston feel like the sole breadwinner. I wore muted colors and off-the-rack cardigans, playing the role of the invisible, supportive wife. Tonight, that charade was officially over. I slipped into a custom-tailored emerald green power suit, crafted from Italian silk and wool blend. The cut was razor-sharp, accentuating my posture and radiating absolute authority. I paired it with a sleek pair of black stiletto heels and a vintage diamond tennis bracelet that alone was worth more than anything Preston owned. I pulled my hair back into a severe, elegant chignon and applied a bold, crimson lipstick. Looking in the mirror, I did not see a discarded bookkeeper. I saw the sole proprietor of Apex Holdings. I handed the keys of my blacked-out SUV to the valet stationed at the bottom of the Oak Cliff Mansion driveway. He blinked in surprise, clearly recognizing me, but utterly confused by my transformation. I did not offer an explanation. I simply walked up the wide stone steps and pushed open the heavy oak doors. The cavernous foyer was buzzing with loud conversation and the clinking of champagne flutes. The room was packed with the local commercial real estate elite. I recognized bank underwriters, property developers, and venture capitalists scattered throughout the crowd. Preston was standing near the grand staircase holding court, with a group of investors laughing loudly at his own joke. Sienna was clinging to his arm, wearing a white sequined gown that looked desperately bridal. I stepped down into the sunken living room, and the subtle click of my stilettos against the imported marble floor seemed to slice through the ambient noise. One by one, heads began to turn. Conversations trailed off into awkward silence as people noticed me. The local elites knew who I was. They knew me as Preston and his quiet soon-to-be ex-wife. But the woman walking toward them commanded the room with an intimidating icy presence they had never seen before. The collective silence spread across the room until the entire party was practically staring at me. Preston stopped mid-laugh. His jaw visibly tightened as his eyes scanned my tailored suit and the undeniable confidence radiating from every step I took. He looked completely thrown off balance, unable to reconcile this version of me with the woman he had kicked out less than 2 weeks ago. Sienna, however, recovered quickly. Her face flushed with anger at the fact that I had just stolen the attention of her entire guest list. She let go of his arm and then marched directly toward me, her heels clicking aggressively. She stopped a few feet away, crossing her arms and looking me up and down with a manufactured expression of pity. "Audrey, what on earth are you wearing?" Sienna asked, her voice loud enough for the surrounding investors to hear clearly. "This is an engagement celebration, not a corporate board meeting. I told you to find a new place in society, but I did not mean you had to dress up like a pretend executive to do it." I stopped and looked at her, letting a few agonizing seconds of silence build. The crowd watched with bated breath. "I think the suit is perfectly appropriate for the occasion, Sienna." I replied, my voice smooth and projecting effortlessly across the quiet room. After all, managing a household requires a certain level of administrative skill. "I am just dressing for the environment," Sienna sneered, leaning in closer so she could whisper, without the investors hearing her exact words. "You look ridiculous. Did you rent that outfit just to impress people who already know you are completely broke? Everyone here knows Preston cut you off. You have absolutely nothing. You are only here because Patricia wanted to humiliate you." I smiled warmly, looking past her shoulder to meet Preston and his nervous gaze. He was watching the exchange, closely gripping his champagne glass a little too tightly. "I am not here to impress anyone, Sienna," I said calmly, shifting my attention back to her flushed face. "I am simply here to check on my property and ensure the current occupants are maintaining the structural integrity of the house." Sienna let out a sharp, mocking laugh, rolling her eyes. "Your property? You really are delusional, Audrey. You do not own a single brick in this neighborhood." I did not argue. I took a slow sip from a glass of sparkling water. I let her enjoy her false sense of superiority, knowing the absolute destruction of her high society life was rapidly approaching. Before Sienna could launch into another tirade about my financial status, a nervous voice broke the tension. "Come on, Audrey, let us not do this here." I turned to see Colin, Preston's older brother, shuffling awkwardly toward us. Colin was the exact opposite of Preston. Where Preston was aggressive and arrogant, Colin was entirely spineless, a man who had spent his entire life bending to the will of his mother and brother. He looked deeply uncomfortable, constantly adjusting his collar and glancing around at the whispering guests. "Just go home, Audrey." Colin pleaded quietly, stepping between Sienna and me. You are only embarrassing yourself. Preston is already furious and my mother is about to have security escort you out. Just leave now and save face before this gets ugly. You do not belong in this crowd anymore. I opened my mouth to reply, but a sharp melodic laugh rang out from the grand staircase. I think she belongs here more than anyone else in this room, Colin. The crowd parted as Jasmine descended the stairs. She looked absolutely breathtaking in a sleek, asymmetrical crimson gown that contrasted beautifully against her rich, dark skin. She held a crystal flute of champagne in one hand and carried herself with the lethal confidence of a woman who destroyed corporate executives in the courtroom for a living. Unlike her husband, Jasmine was fearless. She walked right past Colin, completely ignoring his frantic gestures to stop and stopped right beside me. Jasmine looked me up and down, a genuine smile lighting up her face. Emerald green is definitely your color, Audrey, she said loudly, ensuring her voice carried across the silent living room. It gives off a very distinct CEO aura. It is a massive upgrade from the wife uniform they forced you to wear all these years. Sienna scoffed, her face turning a darker shade of red. Jasmine, what are you doing? You are supposed to be supporting family. Jasmine turned her sharp gaze to Sienna, her smile never faltering. I am supporting family, Sienna. Audrey is legally still my sister-in-law. And frankly, she is the only person in this room I actually respect. Jasmine raised her champagne flute high in the air, turning to face the crowd of elite investors and developers. I would like to propose a toast, she announced brightly. To Audrey, for finally dropping the dead weight and stepping into her true power, and to Sienna for taking out the trash. Jasmine took a sip of her champagne and then lowered her glass, her eyes locking onto Sienna's white sequined dress. By the way, Sienna wearing a bridal gown to an engagement party is incredibly tacky. It screams new money desperation. True old money does not have to try that hard. The room erupted into a mix of shocked gasps and stifled laughter. Several venture capitalists turned away to hide their amusement. Sienna gasped, covering her mouth in sheer horror as the insult landed. Preston finally snapped out of his stunned silence and marched over his face, twisted in absolute fury. Colin, get your wife under control right now, Preston demanded, pointing a trembling finger at Jasmine. She is ruining the event. Patricia pushed her way through the crowd, her tweed suit practically vibrating with rage. How dare you speak to Sienna that way? Patricia hissed at Jasmine. You are a guest in this house. You will show respect to the future lady of this estate. Jasmine did not flinch. She simply took another sip of her champagne and looked at Patricia with absolute boredom. I respect the owner of this estate, Patricia Jasmine replied smoothly. And last time I checked the property records, none of you own a single blade of grass here. Colin grabbed Jasmine's arm, looking terrified. Please, Jasmine, stop. Do not make Mother angry. Jasmine yanked her arm away from him, her eyes flashing with sudden intensity. Do not ever grab me, Colin. I pay the mortgage on our house. I pay for your car. I do not take orders from you, and I certainly do not take orders from your delusional mother or your cheating brother. Jasmine turned back to me, giving me a knowing nod. The entire family stood frozen, utterly humiliated in front of the most powerful people in the city. They thought they were the untouchable kings of real estate. They had no idea that Jasmine and I were simply setting the stage for the final act of their complete and absolute destruction. Preston stood paralyzed by the fireplace, his jaw tightly clenched, utterly incapable of forming a single coherent sentence, as his flawless world slowly shattered. I smiled at Jasmine, raised my glass of sparkling water, and gently clinked it against her champagne flute. To new beginnings, I whispered. The tension in the room was palpable, but Preston, ever the narcissist, could not stand allowing two women to dominate his engagement party. He needed to reclaim the spotlight and reassert his dominance in front of his wealthy investors. He abruptly turned his back on his humiliated mother and furious fiancée, grabbing a crystal spoon and tapping it aggressively against his champagne flute. The sharp, high-pitched ringing cut through the lingering murmurs of the crowd. "May I have your attention?" Preston announced loudly, projecting his voice to the furthest corners of the grand living room. He walked over to the sweeping, curved staircase and stepped up onto the second step, physically elevating himself above his guests. "Let us not allow minor family friction to distract us from the real reason we are gathered here tonight. We are celebrating the future." Sienna quickly plastered a fake smile onto her face and hurried over to stand at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at him with manufactured adoration. Preston raised his glass toward the crowd of venture capitalists and bank underwriters. "As many of you know, this has been a monumental month for my firm." Preston boasted, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. "We are just days away from officially breaking ground on the Crown Plaza development, a project that will completely redefine the downtown skyline. But a true king needs a castle, does he not? That is why I wanted to host you all here tonight. I wanted you to stand inside my latest personal acquisition." He gestured grandly to the vaulted ceilings and the imported marble columns surrounding us. "I bought the Oak Cliff mansion outright," Preston declared, his voice booming with absolute certainty. "No mortgages, no complex financing structures. I acquired this property in a swift, seamless transaction because I wanted to prove a point to the market. When I see something I want, whether it is a prime commercial plot downtown or the most exclusive residential estate in the city, I take it. I own this dirt, and I am officially the premier developer in this region." A smattering of applause broke out among the investors, though a few of the more seasoned bankers exchanged skeptical glances. Real estate titans rarely bought multi-million-dollar mansions outright without leveraging debt. But Preston was too busy basking in his own glory to notice the subtle red flags he was raising. I stood near the fireplace, listening to his arrogant speech with a detached sense of amusement. He was so incredibly confident in his own lies. He had been paying a monthly lease disguised as a mortgage to a blind trust for 5 years, assuming he was building equity in a home he would eventually own. He had never once bothered to look at the actual deed. I handed my glass of sparkling water to a passing waiter and took a slow, deliberate step forward. The crowd, still hyper-aware of my presence after the toast, instantly parted to let me through. I walked directly to the center of the room, stopping just a few feet away from the staircase where Preston was standing. Preston stopped speaking as I approached, his arrogant smile faltering slightly. "What do you want now, Audrey?" he muttered, keeping his voice low enough that only the front row of guests could hear. I did not lower my voice. I spoke clearly and professionally, addressing him as if we were in a corporate boardroom rather than a cocktail party. "I want to clarify a minor detail for the investors in the room, Preston," I said smoothly. "You just claimed you bought this property outright. Are you absolutely sure you own this dirt?" Preston rolled his eyes, letting out a loud, condescending sigh. "Yes, Audrey, I own it. I know basic real estate concepts are difficult for a freelance bookkeeper to grasp, but I assure you, the transaction was handled by top-tier professionals." I tilted my head slightly, maintaining an expression of polite curiosity. "That is fascinating. Because in my professional experience, developers usually know the exact name of the holding company listed on their property deeds. When was the last time you actually checked the legal title of this massive estate, Preston?" The room grew incredibly quiet. A few of the bank underwriters leaned in closer, their professional instincts suddenly activated by my highly technical question. "In commercial real estate, the deed is absolutely everything." Preston sneered, gripping the wooden banister. "You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. I pay the mortgage every single month." "A mortgage is a loan." "Preston," I corrected him gently, "it is not ownership. I asked you who holds the actual deed. Who is your landlord?" Preston stared at me for a fraction of a second before throwing his head back and letting out a booming, theatrical laugh. It was the kind of loud, forced laughter a man uses when he is trying to deflect a question he does not fully understand but desperately needs to control. He looked around the room at his investors, shaking his head, as if I had just asked the most absurd question in the history of commercial real estate. "Listen to her," he said, wiping an imaginary tear from his eye. This is exactly why I had to let her go. You spend your days tracking petty cash for local bakeries. Audrey, you are an ignorant bookkeeper trying to play in the big leagues. You have absolutely no idea how complex financial structuring works at this level of the market. He took another step down the staircase, looking down at me with absolute contempt. When you purchase a property of this magnitude, you do not simply slap your personal name on a piece of public paper. You shield the asset. The deed to this estate is safely held by a private entity. It is a blind trust designed specifically to protect high net worth individuals from liability. I control the trust. Therefore, I own the house. It is a very simple concept that any first-year business student could grasp. I did not break eye contact. I did not flinch at his insults. I simply smiled, a warm, genuine smile that seemed to unnerve him far more than any angry outburst ever could. That is a fascinating strategy. Preston, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. A blind trust offers excellent protection. It is especially useful when the person paying the monthly mortgage is completely oblivious to who actually manages the trust account. I am sure your lawyers did a fantastic job reviewing those documents for you. I took a slow step backward, signaling the end of the conversation. My work here was done. I had planted the seed of doubt right in the middle of his most important networking event. The trap was fully set, and he had just proudly locked himself inside it in front of the most powerful financial players in the city. I glanced over at Sienna. Her manufactured smile had completely vanished. The aggressive confidence she had displayed just moments ago was gone, replaced by a sudden creeping anxiety. She was staring at me, her eyes darting back and forth, searching my face for any sign of bluffing. Unlike Preston, Sienna grew up around ruthless corporate raiders. She knew what a calculated threat looked like, and she was finally beginning to realize that my emerald green power suit was not a costume. It was a warning. I gave her a polite, slight nod. "Enjoy the house, Sienna," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "Make sure you take excellent care of those imported French hardwood floors." Without waiting for a response, I turned around and began walking toward the heavy oak front doors. The crowd of elite guests parted for me once again, but this time the atmosphere was entirely different. Wealthy investors were no longer looking at me with pity or amusement. They were whispering among themselves, their professional instincts fully engaged. An underwriter from a major bank leaned toward his colleague, muttering something about verifying the collateral on the Crown Plaza loan. A venture capitalist frowned, checking his phone and typing rapidly. Preston had tried to humiliate me, but all he had done was expose his own staggering ignorance to the exact people he needed to fund his empire. A real estate titan does not blindly pay into a trust without knowing the ultimate beneficiary. Patricia tried to step in my way as I neared the exit, her face twisted in a bitter scowl. "You are a disgrace, Audrey," she hissed quietly. I ignored her completely, stepping around her, as if she were nothing more than a piece of misplaced furniture. Jasmine was standing near the entryway holding her champagne flute. She raised it slightly as I walked past, a silent salute to a perfectly executed maneuver. I pushed open the heavy front doors and stepped out into the cool evening air, leaving the stifling arrogance of the Oak Cliff mansion behind me. The valet quickly brought my black SUV around. I tipped him generously, climbed inside it, and started the car engine. As I drove down the winding driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror, looking at the glowing lights of the sprawling estate. Preston thought he was the king of the castle, celebrating his ultimate victory. He had absolutely no idea that his entire kingdom was built on my land, and the eviction notice was already on its way. The morning after the disastrous engagement party dawned bright and clear over the city skyline. Preston woke up feeling absolutely invincible. He had completely dismissed my warnings from the night before, chalking them up to the bitter ramblings of a jealous, soon-to-be ex-wife. In his mind, I was nothing more than a minor annoyance, a ghost from his past trying and failing to cast a shadow over his massive success. He put on his most expensive charcoal gray suit, adjusted his silk tie, and ordered his driver to take him straight to the downtown financial district. Today was the day he would cement his legacy. He was scheduled to finalize the $50 million construction loan that would allow him to officially break ground on the Crown Plaza development. The heavy glass doors of First National Trust swung open as Preston strutted into the opulent marble lobby. He moved with the exaggerated swagger of a man who believed he owned the entire building. The bank staff immediately recognized him, and a junior associate hurriedly escorted him to the executive boardroom on the top floor. The room was a sterile sanctuary of high finance featuring floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the very district Preston intended to conquer. A massive mahogany table dominated the space surrounded by plush leather chairs. Sitting at the far end of the table was the senior loan underwriter, a meticulous older man named Gregory. Gregory was known in the industry for being ruthless and entirely devoid of emotion. He cared only about hard numbers, solid equity, and bulletproof legal contracts. Preston tossed his custom leather briefcase onto the polished wood table with a heavy thud. "Good morning, Gregory," he announced loudly, taking the seat at the head of the table. "I brought the executed master lease for the Crown Plaza just like we discussed. The ink is dry, the 99-year term is locked in, and Apex Holdings is officially out of my way. We are ready to fund this project and start digging." Gregory adjusted his silver wire-rimmed glasses and pulled the thick file folder toward him. "Good morning, Preston. It is always a pleasure to see a developer moving with such aggressive momentum." He opened the folder and began scanning the first few pages of the lease agreement. "The bank is highly interested in this project. The location is prime, and the commercial demand in that sector is currently peaking. However, $50 million is a substantial exposure for us. We need to finalize the collateralization before I can authorize the wire transfer to your construction escrow account." Preston leaned back in his leather chair, lacing his fingers together behind his head. He smiled a wide, predatory smile, completely unbothered by the massive financial risk he was taking. "I understand completely, Gregory," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You guys need your safety nets, but you have absolutely nothing to worry about. I am securing this loan with the finest hard assets in the entire metropolitan area." Preston reached into his briefcase and pulled out two thick, glossy portfolios, sliding them across the table. "First, I am putting up the Oak Cliff Mansion. The property was recently appraised at $12 million, and it sits in the most exclusive residential zip code in the state. It is fully modernized, pristine, and entirely unencumbered by any traditional bank mortgages. That house alone covers a massive chunk of your required equity position." Gregory picked up the residential portfolio, nodding slowly as he flipped through the high-resolution photographs of the estate. "It is a stunning property, Preston. And what is the second asset?" Preston tapped the table confidently. "The second asset is my crown jewel, the corporate headquarters of my development firm, the 10-story office building right on the corner of 5th and Main. We occupy the top 3 floors and lease the rest to premium corporate tenants. It generates massive monthly cash flow, and the building itself is easily valued at $40 million. Combined with the mansion, I am offering you over $50 million in premium physical collateral to secure this construction loan. You hold the paper on my house and my office, and I take your money to build the Crown Plaza. It is a bulletproof deal, Gregory." Gregory pushed his glasses slightly further up the bridge of his nose. He picked up his gold pen and clicked it twice, a sharp sound echoing in the quiet boardroom. "On paper, Preston, this looks like a remarkably strong position. The loan-to-value ratio is well within our aggressive lending parameters. We need our legal department to run the standard title searches and verify the ultimate beneficial ownership of the collateral properties. It is a simple administrative hurdle." Gregory pressed a silver button on the console built into the mahogany table. A moment later, the heavy boardroom doors opened, and a junior compliance officer walked in carrying a secure digital tablet. She handed it directly to Gregory without saying a word. This is standard procedure, Preston Gregory explained, tapping the screen to wake it up. We run a deep dive title search on all physical collateral to ensure there are no hidden liens, obscure tax liabilities, or holding companies masking alternative ownership. We just need to verify that you are the ultimate beneficial owner of the blind trust holding the Oak Cliff mansion and the corporate entity controlling your office building. Preston waved his hand dismissively, checking his gold watch. Take all the time you need, Gregory. I have nothing to hide. Everything I have built is rock solid. Gregory adjusted his glasses and began scrolling through the compliance report. For a few moments, the only sound in the massive room was the soft swiping of his finger against the glass screen. Then Gregory stopped moving. His brow furrowed deeply. He scrolled back up, read something again, and then looked up at the junior compliance officer standing quietly in the corner. She gave him a grave nod. Gregory set the tablet down flat on the table and folded his hands. The warm, professional demeanor he had displayed just moments ago vanished entirely, replaced by the cold, calculating caution of a senior risk manager. Preston, we have a serious discrepancy here, Gregory said, his voice flat. Preston chuckled casually, pouring himself a glass of sparkling water from the crystal pitcher on the table. A discrepancy? What did my accountant misspell my middle name on the tax filings? Just highlight the page and I will have my team send over an amendment this afternoon. This is not a spelling error, Preston Gregory replied strictly. Our legal team cannot verify you as the ultimate beneficial owner of either property you just offered as collateral. Preston froze the glass of water halfway to his mouth. He lowered it slowly, his arrogant smile completely disappearing. What are you talking about? I own that house. I own that office building. I pay the mortgages every single month from my primary corporate operating account. Your legal team must be using outdated software. Gregory turned the tablet around and slid it across the smooth wood so Preston could see the screen. The software is state-of-the-art. According to the county property registrar and our internal forensic search, the blind trust holding the deed to the Oak Cliff mansion is not registered to you. You are not listed as the beneficiary, the trustee, or the grantor. You have zero legal connection to that trust. Preston stared at the screen, his face flushing with a sudden wave of hot anger. That is impossible. I have been paying into that trust for 5 years. My lawyers set it up specifically to shield my residential equity. It gets worse. Preston Gregory continued tapping a different tab on the screen. The corporate office building is not owned by your development firm. The deed is held entirely by a private entity called Apex Holdings. We pulled the corporate registration for Apex Holdings, and your name is completely absent from their executive roster. You are simply listed as a commercial tenant. You do not own these buildings, Preston. You lease them. Preston stood up so fast, his heavy leather chair slammed into the glass wall behind him. This is absolutely ridiculous, he shouted, his voice echoing violently across the quiet boardroom. You are telling me I am a tenant in my own home. I am a tenant in the building with my name glowing on the side of it. Your clerks are incompetent, Gregory. This is a massive clerical error. Some lazy paralegal mixed up the corporate identification numbers. Gregory remained perfectly still, completely unfazed by the outburst. The bank does not make $50 million clerical errors, Preston. Until your legal team can provide certified documentation proving you hold the ultimate equity in these properties, this loan application is indefinitely paused. I cannot fund a construction project using someone else's real estate as collateral. Preston snatched his phone from the table, his hands shaking with rage. He paced toward the massive windows, ignoring Gregory entirely. I am calling my lead attorney right now, he snarled, dialing the familiar number aggressively. This will be fixed immediately. He genuinely believed it was just a minor mistake. He still had absolutely no idea that his entire empire belonged to me. The line clicked open. Fix this clerical error, Preston barked into the receiver, completely ignoring any professional greetings. The bank thinks I am just a tenant. I need corrected documents sent over right away, understand? There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Preston paced aggressively in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, his leather shoes squeaking slightly against the polished hardwood of the boardroom. He glared out at the city skyline, expecting an immediate apology from his legal team for the inconvenience. Instead, the only sound he heard was the ragged, uneven breathing of his lead corporate attorney, Bradley. Bradley was a seasoned bulldog of a lawyer who charged $1,000 an hour and never lost his composure. But right now, he sounded as though he had just sprinted up 10 flights of stairs. Preston, I need you to calm down and listen to me very carefully. Bradley finally said, his voice shaking violently. This is not a clerical error. I just ran an emergency deep dive forensic trace on the holding companies at your request. I pulled the master registry files directly from the State Corporate Commission. Preston stopped pacing, his chest tightening with the first genuine pang of fear he had felt in years. What are you talking about, Bradley? I pay you a small fortune to manage my assets. Just send the bank the confirmation that I own the blind trust. I cannot do that. Preston Bradley stammered, the panic in his voice escalating. Because you do not own it. You never did. The blind trust holding the deed to the Oak Cliff mansion was established 6 years ago. It is an impenetrable legal shell designed to receive payments while completely shielding the identity of the true beneficiary. You assumed you were the beneficiary because your previous legal team set up the payment structure. But you were just paying rent into a void. Preston gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white. What do you mean I was paying rent? I bought that house. I am the owner. You are a tenant. Preston Bradley replied, his voice cracking. You signed a highly complex lease-to-own agreement that was heavily disguised as a standard mortgage schedule. And the corporate office building is the exact same situation. You do not own the equity. You have been leasing the office space for 5 years. Preston felt the blood drain completely from his face. The opulent boardroom suddenly felt suffocatingly small. He looked over at Gregory, who was sitting perfectly still at the mahogany table watching the meltdown with cold, clinical detachment. Then who owns it? Preston demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper. Who the hell is Apex Holdings? Who is collecting my money? Bradley took a sharp, ragged breath. The silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds. When he finally spoke, every single word hit Preston like a physical blow to the chest. Preston. The office building. The Crown Plaza land. The mansion? None of it is yours, Bradley said, his voice barely above a whisper. They are all owned by Apex Holdings. And the sole proprietor of Apex Holdings, the only individual with absolute executive control over every single asset you just tried to leverage, is Audrey. Preston stood frozen. The phone slipped slightly in his sweaty palm. Say that again, he choked out, unable to process the words. It is Audrey, Bradley repeated, his tone laced with absolute sheer terror. Your wife owns Apex Holdings. She owns the house you live in. She owns the building you work in. And Preston, you just signed a 99-year master lease for the Crown Plaza dirt that gives her absolute authority over your new development. She is your landlord. She holds every single string. The phone slipped from the grip of Preston and clattered loudly onto the polished mahogany table. He could still hear the frantic voice of Bradley echoing faintly from the speaker, asking if he was still there, but Preston could not form a single word. His legs gave out. He collapsed backward into the heavy leather chair, his mind spinning violently out of control. Every insult he had hurled at me in the Michelin-starred restaurant echoed in his head. He had called me a freelance bookkeeper. He had allowed his cruel mistress to hand me a janitor uniform. He had laughed in my face at the engagement party just last night, calling me an ignorant woman who did not understand complex financial structuring. He finally understood what he had never once bothered to ask me. I was not tracking petty cash for local bakeries. I was tracking him and building my empire. Gregory picked up his gold pen and placed it neatly into his suit pocket. He looked at the pale, sweating developer sitting across from him. I assume the collateral is no longer available, Gregory stated flatly. The loan application is officially denied. Have a good day, Preston. Preston did not say a single word in response to the senior underwriter. He mechanically reached across the polished mahogany table with trembling hands, sweeping the glossy portfolios of the Oak Cliff mansion and his corporate office building back into his custom leather briefcase. The heavy brass clasps clicked shut, sounding unnaturally loud in the silent boardroom. He stood up on unsteady legs, his expensive charcoal gray suit suddenly feeling incredibly heavy, suffocatingly tight around his chest. Without looking at Gregory again, Preston turned and stumbled out of the heavy glass doors, leaving his $50 million construction loan dead on the table. The elevator ride down to the main lobby felt like an eternity. The mirrored walls of the cab reflected a man whose entire reality had just been violently shattered. He practically sprinted through the opulent marble lobby of First National Trust, ignoring the polite nods of the bank staff who had eagerly welcomed him just an hour earlier. He burst through the front doors into the bright sunlight, gasping for air, as if he had been drowning. He barked at his driver to take him back to the office immediately, aggressively sliding into the back seat of his luxury sedan and staring blankly out the tinted window as the city skyline blurred past him. The moment the car pulled up to the curb of his corporate headquarters, Preston bolted out. He marched through the revolving glass doors of the towering 10-story building, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. He stormed past the sleek reception desk on the top floor, completely ignoring his assistant, who was frantically trying to hand him a stack of urgent messages. He slammed the heavy oak door of his massive corner office shut, locking it with a sharp click. He threw his briefcase onto his glass desk and immediately dropped to his knees in front of the locked steel filing cabinets lining the far wall. He fumbled with his keys, finally yanking the heavy metal drawer open. He began frantically pulling out thick, heavy binders labeled with the financial histories of the past 5 years. He dumped them onto the floor, sitting cross-legged in his expensive suit, and violently flipped through hundreds of pages of bank statements, tax returns, and executed lease agreements. His breathing was shallow and erratic as his eyes darted across the tiny black text he had spent half a decade ignoring. He flipped to the payment ledger for the Oak Cliff mansion. For 5 years, on the first of every single month, his primary corporate operating account automatically wired a massive payment to an entity listed as the Oak Cliff Heritage Trust. He traced the routing numbers, his fingers shaking, as he followed the digital paper trail to the parent company managing the trust account. The parent company was a holding firm registered in Delaware. He grabbed his laptop from the desk, pulled up the state corporate registry database, and typed in the registration number. The screen loaded. The parent firm was a wholly owned subsidiary of Apex Holdings. Preston let out a strangled, breathless gasp. He threw the residential binder aside and grabbed the thick file containing the corporate lease for the very building he was sitting in. He flipped to the signature page. He had signed it 5 years ago, assuming he was leasing the space from an old traditional property management group before eventually buying it out. He looked at the countersignature. It was signed by a proxy lawyer representing Apex Holdings. The horrifying truth crashed down on him with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. Every single month, he had proudly written a massive check for his office rent. Every single month, he had proudly paid the mortgage on the sprawling luxury estate where he hosted his elite friends. He had spent years mocking me for being a quiet freelance bookkeeper who brought absolutely nothing to the table. He had ridiculed me for clipping coupons and managing mundane receipts. But all those years while he was out playing the hotshot developer and accumulating massive corporate debt to fund his arrogant lifestyle, I was the one quietly cashing his massive checks. I was not doing basic bookkeeping. I was managing his money, taking his monthly payments, and using his own aggressive cash flow to continually expand the massive portfolio of Apex Holdings. He was not a real estate king. He was my highest-paying tenant. He had been blindly renting his entire luxurious life directly from his own wife for half a decade without ever once noticing. He finally broke down and slowly dropped his face into his shaking hands, the sharp edges of the paper cutting his fingers slightly as he sat surrounded by the cold, undeniable documented proof of his own absolute stupidity. The heavy silence in the locked corner office was broken only by the sound of Preston's ragged breathing. He remained on the floor, surrounded by the scattered financial binders for what felt like hours, but was only a matter of minutes. The crushing realization that he possessed absolutely zero physical equity in his own life was paralyzing. His entire net worth was a carefully constructed illusion built on massive corporate debt and high-interest lines of credit. He had always justified his reckless spending by pointing to the massive theoretical value of his real estate portfolio. But without the mansion and the office building, his portfolio was practically empty. He was essentially a high-paid contractor drowning in massive overhead costs. He scrambled to his feet, his expensive suit wrinkled and damp with cold sweat. He threw himself into his desk chair and grabbed his office phone, dialing the direct extension of his chief accountant, Thomas. He needed to know exactly how much liquid cash he had immediately accessible. He needed to figure out a way to hide this catastrophic failure from the market, from his investors, and most importantly, from Sienna. If Sienna found out he was not the billionaire developer he claimed to be, she would leave him before the ink on their wedding invitations was even dry. The line clicked, and Thomas answered politely. "Thomas, pull up my personal and corporate operating accounts right now," Preston demanded, his voice tight and frantic. "Give me the exact liquid cash total, everything that is not tied up in escrow or pending payroll." There was a brief pause as the clicking of a keyboard echoed over the line. "Your liquid cash reserves are extremely low right now," Preston Thomas said, his tone cautious. "You just wired a massive non-refundable deposit to secure the Crown Plaza contractors. You also pulled heavily from your personal accounts to pay for the engagement party, the custom caterers, and the imported floral arrangements. Not to mention the diamond ring you bought Sienna." "Give me the damn number," Thomas Preston snapped, slamming his hand against the glass desk. "Across all accessible accounts, you have roughly $85,000 in liquid capital," Thomas replied. "And your revolving credit lines are completely maxed out. You are depending on that $50 million construction loan closing today to float the firm through the next quarter. If that loan does not fund by Friday, we will not be able to make payroll next week." Preston felt the room spin. $85,000. It sounded like a lot of money to an average person, but for a commercial developer with a massive payroll and millions in impending liabilities, it was absolute bankruptcy. It was less than the cost of the engagement party he had just thrown. "Move the money!" Preston screamed into the phone, losing the last shred of his composure. "Drain the vendor accounts. Delay the contractor payments. I do not care what you have to do, just generate some cash and hide the deficit. You are my accountant. Figure it out. You cannot delay contractor payments on a project this size." Preston Thomas argued, his voice rising in alarm. "That is a direct breach of contract. If word gets out that you are missing payments, your investors will pull their backing immediately. You are over-leveraged." "I am not over-leveraged," Preston roared, standing up and kicking the heavy leather chair backward. "I am the victim of a massive financial fraud. My wife stole my assets. Just do what I am telling you to do, or I will fire you and ruin your career." Before Preston could scream another threat, the heavy oak door to his office suddenly clicked and swung open. He had forgotten to relock it after his panic attack on the floor. Sienna stood in the doorway holding a branded shopping bag from a luxury boutique. Her perfectly contoured face was frozen in an expression of absolute shock. She slowly lowered the shopping bag, her eyes darting from the scattered binders on the floor to the terrified, sweating face of her fiancé. She stepped into the office and closed the door behind her, the click echoing loudly in the tense silence. "Who exactly is over-leveraged, Preston?" she asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "And what do you mean your wife stole your assets?" Preston slammed the phone down onto the receiver, his mind racing to formulate a convincing lie. "Sienna, baby, it is just a minor clerical dispute," he stammered, forcing a sickly smile. "The bank is being overly cautious about the Crown Plaza loan. It is a temporary cash flow hiccup." "Do not lie to me," Sienna snapped, stepping forward angrily into the room. "You are broke. You are broke. Sienna stood in the center of the office, her eyes narrowed in absolute disgust. The luxury shopping bag in her hand suddenly looked entirely out of place in the room of a man who could not even afford his own rent. Preston scrambled up from his chair, waving his hands in a frantic gesture of denial. I am not broke, Sienna, he pleaded, his voice dripping with desperation. You do not understand how community property works in this state. It does not matter what kind of corporate shell game Audrey is playing. We are legally married. She built Apex Holdings while we were together. Under marital asset laws, I am entitled to 50% of everything she owns. Sienna paused, her anger slowly shifting into a cold, calculating realization. 50%, she repeated, her tone sharpening. You are telling me your plain, boring wife secretly owns a multi-million-dollar real estate empire and you can just take half of it? Exactly, Preston said eagerly, grabbing onto the lifeline she was throwing him. It is a massive legal blunder on her part. She thought she could hide her money in a blind trust and humiliate me, but all she did was build my empire for me. We are going to hire the most ruthless litigation firm in the city. We are going to file an emergency injunction, freeze every single asset Apex Holdings controls, and take her for everything she is worth. Sienna dropped the shopping bag onto the leather sofa, her lips curling into a wicked smile. Get your coat, she ordered sharply. We are going right now. They left the corporate headquarters in a frenzy, completely ignoring the panicked staff, trying to get Preston to sign emergency payroll authorizations. Preston ordered his driver to speed through the downtown traffic, heading straight for the towering glass skyscraper that housed Kensington and Ward, the most aggressive family law and corporate litigation firm in the state. Preston had paid them a massive retainer earlier in the year, assuming he would need them to crush Audrey during a standard divorce proceeding. He had no idea how vital that retainer was about to become. During the short ride, Sienna was already planning how to spend the settlement. She talked rapidly about liquidating the office building and using the cash to fund the Crown Plaza project without the bank. Preston nodded along, feeding her delusions while secretly trying to calm his own racing heart. He needed this lawsuit to work. If he did not secure half of Apex Holdings immediately, his entire life would collapse into absolute ruin. The luxury sedan pulled up to the curb, and they practically sprinted through the revolving doors. The lobby of Kensington and Ward was a testament to the brutal wealth they extracted from their clients, featuring imported Italian marble and massive abstract paintings. Preston marched directly to the front reception desk, slamming his hand flat against the polished granite counter. I need the senior litigation team right now, Preston barked at the terrified receptionist. I am a platinum retainer client, and this is an absolute financial emergency. Clear the boardroom. The receptionist frantically typed on her computer, her hands shaking slightly under his aggressive glare. Right away, sir, she stammered, picking up her phone. I will let them know you are here. Please head straight back to boardroom A. Preston did not even wait for her to finish speaking. He grabbed Sienna by the arm and stormed down the long glass hallway. He felt a sudden surge of his old arrogance returning. He was a wealthy developer walking into a high-powered law firm ready to launch a massive legal strike. Audrey had caught him off guard this morning, but she was just a bookkeeper playing out of her league. She did not have the legal firepower to withstand a coordinated attack from a top-tier corporate litigation team. He was going to drag her into court, humiliate her publicly, and strip her of every single property she had secretly acquired. He reached the heavy frosted glass doors of boardroom A and pushed them open aggressively. The room was massive, featuring a long, sleek conference table overlooking the city. We are filing an emergency lawsuit today, Preston announced loudly as he strode into the room, pulling out a leather chair for Sienna. My wife has been hiding marital assets through a corporate entity called Apex Holdings, and I want 50% of the entire portfolio seized immediately. I want her bank accounts frozen, and I want her forced out of my properties by the end of the week. Preston slammed his leather briefcase onto the polished mahogany table, expecting to see a team of eager attorneys ready to aggressively litigate his massive financial case. Preston slammed his leather briefcase onto the mahogany table, expecting to see eager attorneys ready to litigate his massive financial case. Instead, the boardroom was entirely empty, except for one person sitting quietly at the far end of the long table. It was Jasmine. She was wearing a tailored charcoal gray suit with a crisp white blouse, looking every bit the ruthless corporate attorney she was. She had a thick manila folder resting on the table in front of her and was calmly sipping iced water. Preston froze, his hand resting on the handle of his briefcase. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "I asked for the senior litigation team, not my brother's wife." "Get out of here, Jasmine. This is a highly confidential legal matter." Jasmine did not flinch. She slowly set her water glass down and opened the manila folder. "I am not here as your sister-in-law, Preston," she said, her voice cool and professional. "The senior litigation team you asked for is declining your case. When your frantic assistant called ahead to demand an emergency injunction against Apex Holdings, the partners immediately ran a conflict of interest check." Preston furrowed his brow, completely confused. "Conflict of interest? What conflict?" "The conflict, Preston, is that Kensington and Ward cannot represent you in a lawsuit against Apex Holdings because Apex Holdings is our highest-paying corporate client," Jasmine explained, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across her face. "In fact, they are our absolute top priority. I am their lead corporate counsel. I represent Audrey." Sienna gasped, taking a step back as if she had just been physically struck. Preston stood paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. He looked around the empty boardroom, the crushing reality of his situation finally locking into place. He had walked right into the heart of Audrey's legal fortress completely willingly. "You cannot do this!" Preston finally sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. "It is a massive breach of ethics. You are family. I will have you disbarred. I will sue this entire firm for malpractice. I am entitled to half of those assets under state law. Audrey built that company while we were married. It is community property." Jasmine let out a sharp, genuinely amused laugh. She stood up from her chair, leaning forward slightly and planting her hands flat on the mahogany table. "You really need to start reading the documents you sign," Preston, Jasmine said, her tone shifting to absolute clinical destruction. "Audrey did not build Apex Holdings during your marriage. She established the primary holding company 3 years before she even met you, using a massive private inheritance from her grandfather. It is completely classified as a strictly premarital asset." Preston shook his head violently, refusing the truth. "That does not matter. The portfolio grew heavily during our marriage. The income generated is marital property. I have rights to the appreciation." "You would have rights to the appreciation if the assets were mingled," Jasmine corrected him, her legal dismantling executed with surgical precision. "But Audrey is a brilliant financial mind. She constructed an impenetrable double LLC shell to isolate the capital. Apex Holdings is a parent company that solely owns individual subsidiary LLCs for every single property. The income generated from your monthly rent payments never touched a joint marital account. It was entirely reinvested back into the corporate shell. Her personal income, the modest bookkeeping money you constantly mocked, was the only capital she brought into the marriage. The corporate assets are completely insulated and strictly untouchable." Preston sank into the nearest leather chair, his legs unable to support him any longer. The arrogant developer who had swaggered into the building demanding aggressive legal action was entirely gone, replaced by a broken, heavily indebted man facing absolute financial ruin. Furthermore, Jasmine continued picking up a document from her folder and sliding it across the long table toward him. "Audrey formally accepts your divorce petition. Since you filed the initial paperwork stating you wish to retain your primary business assets and waive any spousal support, she generously agrees to those exact terms. You keep your debt-ridden development firm, and she keeps Apex Holdings. It is a perfectly clean break, just like you wanted." Sienna turned to look at Preston, her eyes wide with sheer panic. He had absolutely nothing. He owned no property, he had zero equity, and his company was effectively bankrupt. The luxurious high society life she desperately thought she was marrying into was a complete mirage. Jasmine closed her folder and picked up her expensive briefcase. "We will see you in court to finalize the paperwork, Preston. Good luck finding a new lawyer, and good luck funding your new project." Preston staggered out of the Kensington and Ward skyscraper, a completely shattered man, but his massive ego refused to accept absolute defeat. Instead of calling his investors to admit his financial ruin, he decided to double down on his own delusions. He spent the entire night frantically calling his public relations team, demanding they organize an emergency press conference at the Crown Plaza development site the very next morning. He reasoned that if he could just project enough confidence on local television and officially announce the groundbreaking, the bank underwriters might feel public pressure to ignore the holding company discrepancies and approve the $50 million loan. It was a spectacular display of sheer desperate arrogance. By 10 o'clock the next morning, a makeshift stage was erected on the massive empty dirt lot downtown. Behind the wooden podium, several large excavators and bulldozers were parked strategically to create the illusion of impending construction. A crowd of local financial reporters, real estate bloggers, and a handful of nervous private investors stood milling around in the morning heat. Preston stepped up to the microphones wearing a hard hat and a bright orange reflective vest over his expensive suit, attempting to look like a man of action. Sienna was conspicuously absent, having completely refused to answer his calls since fleeing the law firm the previous afternoon. Her sudden disappearance should have been his final warning to surrender, but Preston simply gripped the edges of the podium and forced a wide, unnatural smile for the flashing cameras. "Thank you all for coming out on such short notice." Preston projected his voice loudly, trying to mask the slight tremor in his hands. "Today marks a historic turning point for our city. We are standing on the future site of the Crown Plaza, a $500 million development that will redefine the skyline. Rumors have been circulating about administrative delays regarding our funding, but I am here today to officially put those whispers to rest. We have successfully secured the 99-year master lease for this land, and our $50 million initial construction loan is currently in the final stages of executive approval. We will be breaking ground by the end of the week." The reporters began to raise their hands to ask questions about the exact terms of the lease, but before Preston could call on anyone, a deep rumbling sound echoed across the dirt lot. Every head in the crowd turned toward the chain-link construction gates. A fleet of 3 massive black SUVs pulled off the main street and drove directly onto the property, aggressively kicking up thick clouds of dust as they bypassed the security checkpoint. Preston froze mid-sentence, his artificial smile collapsing instantly. The vehicles came to a sharp halt just a few yards away from the press podium. The doors of the lead SUV swung open, and I stepped out onto the dirt lot. I was wearing a sharp-tailored beige trench coat over a black turtleneck, my posture radiating absolute control. Jasmine stepped out from the second vehicle carrying her heavy legal briefcase, followed immediately by a team of 6 stern-faced corporate auditors wearing matching dark suits. The local financial reporters immediately recognized me from the televised engagement party fiasco. Camera shutters began firing rapidly, capturing every single second of the confrontation. The investors in the crowd started whispering urgently among themselves, sensing that the rumors of Preston facing absolute financial ruin were entirely true. Preston panicked, gripping the microphone tightly. "Security!" he shouted, his voice cracking slightly over the loudspeakers. "Remove these unauthorized individuals from my active construction site immediately." The 2 hired security guards stepped forward, but Jasmine smoothly intercepted them, holding up a thick stack of court-stamped documents. "We are the legal representatives of Apex Holdings, the absolute owner of this property," Jasmine announced, her voice carrying clearly without the need for a microphone. "We are here to conduct an emergency forensic audit of the premises. Stand down immediately or you will be named as accomplices in a massive corporate trespassing lawsuit." The guards took one look at the official court seals and immediately backed away, entirely unwilling to risk their jobs for a desperate developer. I walked straight past them, my heels crunching softly against the loose gravel, and then stopped right in front of the tall wooden podium. Preston was sweating profusely, his face extremely pale and completely terrified as he looked down at me. The news cameras were rolling live, broadcasting his absolute panic to the entire city. He frantically tried to lean into the microphone to salvage the disastrous situation, but he had absolutely no power left. He was standing directly on my dirt, and I was finally fully ready to bury his fake empire. I stepped up onto the wooden platform, my beige trench coat catching the slight morning breeze. Preston stumbled backward, as if I had physically pushed him, his expensive hard hat tilting slightly on his head. He looked absolutely pathetic. I did not even look at him. I reached out and pulled the microphone stand toward me, adjusting it to my height. The local financial reporters immediately shoved their recorders and microphones closer to the stage, their eyes wide with anticipation. The live news cameras zoomed in, locking onto my face. I looked out over the crowd of investors and journalists, letting a brief moment of absolute silence settle over the dirt lot. "Good morning, everyone," I began, my voice projecting loudly and clearly across the property. "My name is Audrey. Until a few days ago, I was known simply as the quiet wife of the developer standing behind me. But today, I am speaking to you in a very different capacity. I am the sole proprietor and the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The flashing of camera lenses instantly intensified, creating a strobe light effect across the wooden podium. Several private investors who had been planning to fund the Crown Plaza project dropped their notebooks, their jaws hanging open in complete shock. Preston let out a strangled noise, trying to step forward and grab the microphone back. "This is a lie," he shouted, his voice cracking. "She is just a disgruntled ex-wife trying to ruin my press conference. Turn the cameras off." Jasmine stepped seamlessly between Preston and the microphone, holding up the thick manila folder containing the corporate registries. "This is a legally verified statement," Jasmine announced, her voice cutting through his panic. "Apex Holdings is the sole owner of this commercial dirt, the Oak Cliff residential estate, and the corporate office building. Any attempt to silence the property owner will result in immediate legal action." Preston shrank back, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. I turned my attention back to the reporters, who were now furiously typing on their digital tablets. "As the legal owner of this land, I need to make an official public statement regarding the master lease agreement," I continued. "A few days ago, my holding company sent over the final execution copy of a 99-year lease, allowing this developer to build the Crown Plaza." He signed it blindly, without ever reading the fine print. If he had bothered to read the legal contract he signed, he would have noticed a highly specific morals clause. I explained, pacing slowly across the wooden stage. "That clause grants the landlord the absolute, unmitigated right to terminate the master lease immediately without any financial penalty in the event of gross executive misconduct, documented infidelity, or unethical financial behavior that could damage the reputation of the property." The reporters were practically vibrating with excitement. This was the biggest financial scandal the city had seen in decades. I turned slightly to look directly at Preston, who was now leaning heavily against a parked bulldozer for physical support. "Over the past month, this developer has engaged in a highly public affair with a subordinate executive." I stated, my words landing like heavy blows. "Furthermore, just yesterday morning, he attempted to secure a $50 million construction loan from First National Trust by fraudulently offering properties he does not own as financial collateral. That is a direct violation of corporate ethics and a massive breach of our contract. Therefore, acting as the sole executive authority of Apex Holdings, I am officially activating the morals clause." Effective immediately, I declared, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "The 99-year master lease for the Crown Plaza is permanently terminated. You have zero rights to this land. You have zero rights to build here." I looked Preston directly in his terrified eyes. "I want your bulldozers, your excavators, and your fake corporate signage removed from my property by midnight tonight. If a single piece of your equipment remains on this dirt tomorrow morning, I will have it seized and sold at auction to cover the massive legal fees you are about to owe me." The crowd of reporters erupted into chaos, shouting dozens of questions all at once. The private investors immediately pulled out their phones, calling their banks to pull their funding. Preston slid slowly down the side of the yellow bulldozer, collapsing onto the dirt lot, completely broken and publicly humiliated. He had wanted an audience to witness his greatest triumph. Instead, I had given him a front-row seat to his own destruction. I stepped away from the podium, leaving the microphone behind. I walked directly back toward my black SUV, with the news cameras following my every step. "Wait, Audrey, wait!" Preston screamed, his voice cracking with absolute panic as he scrambled up from the dirt lot. He lunged forward, grabbing the sleeve of my beige trench coat in a desperate, pathetic attempt to stop me from leaving. The camera crews immediately rushed closer, capturing the humiliating image of the once arrogant developer literally begging on his knees in the dust. I stopped walking and looked down at his hand gripping my sleeve. I did not say a word. I simply stared at his fingers until the heavy silence forced him to realize what he was doing. He slowly let go of my coat, his hands trembling violently. "You cannot do this to me, Audrey," he pleaded, his chest heaving as he struggled to breathe. "I have already wired massive non-refundable deposits to the construction crews. I have vendor contracts I cannot break. If you terminate this master lease right now and kick me off this land, my firm will instantly default. I will be $50 million in debt by tomorrow morning. You are going to bankrupt me." I looked down at the pathetic, sweating man kneeling in the dirt. He was finally experiencing the exact financial terror he had tried to inflict on me when he froze my bank accounts and threw me out of my home. "I am not bankrupting you, Preston," I replied, my voice devoid of any sympathy. "You bankrupted yourself the moment you let your ego blind you to reality. You stood in a Michelin-starred restaurant and handed me a $10,000 check like I was a beggar. You told me you needed a powerhouse partner who built something bigger. You told me I did not belong in your world." I paused, letting my gaze sweep over the empty dirt lot and the fake construction equipment. "I am the empire you were trying to build on, Preston. You were just a tenant playing king in my castle, and your lease is officially up." I turned to Jasmine, who was standing right beside me, holding the legal briefcase. Jasmine handed him the final notice I instructed. Jasmine smiled a sharp, brilliant smile and pulled a thick, legally stamped document from her folder. She dropped it directly onto the dirt right in front of his knees. By the way, Preston, Jasmine added, her tone dripping with satisfaction, "that notice is not just for this dirt lot. It also covers your corporate headquarters. Audrey is terminating the lease on your office building. You have exactly 24 hours to pack up your entire firm and vacate the premises." Before Preston could even process the reality of losing his corporate office, a sharp screech of tires interrupted the scene. A silver sports car slammed into park near the edge of the construction lot. The driver's side door flew open and Sienna stormed out. She had obviously been watching the live local news broadcast from her car and realized her luxurious future was evaporating on live television. She marched across the dirt lot, her expensive designer heels sinking into the mud, completely ignoring the flashing cameras. Sienna, baby, Preston gasped, trying to stand up and salvage his dignity. "Tell them this is a mistake." Sienna stopped right in front of him, her face twisted into a mask of pure, absolute disgust. She looked from the eviction notice in the dirt, up to his terrified, sweating face. "A mistake?" Sienna shrieked, her voice echoing loudly for the news crews to record. "The only mistake here is you, Preston. I just watched your entire net worth disappear on live television. You told me you were a visionary billionaire. You told me you bought that mansion outright. You are $50 million in debt and you do not even own the office you work in." "Sienna, please, we can fix this," Preston begged, reaching out for her hand. "Do not touch me," Sienna snapped, slapping his hand away viciously. "You are a complete fraud. I am the daughter of a private equity investor. I do not date bankrupt tenants who get evicted by their own wives." She reached into her designer purse, pulled out the massive diamond engagement ring he had bought her on credit, and threw it directly at his chest. It bounced off his orange reflective vest and vanished into the thick mud. "We are done, Preston. Do not ever contact me again." Sienna turned on her heel and marched right back to her sports car, leaving him completely alone in the dirt. I did not stay to watch him cry. I simply turned around, climbed into the back of my black SUV, and closed the heavy door. The vehicle pulled away, leaving my former husband to face his massive debts entirely on his own. The interior of my black SUV was perfectly quiet as my driver pulled onto the main highway, leaving the dirt lot behind us. I poured a glass of sparkling water from the chilled console and took a slow, refreshing sip. My phone was already lighting up with a barrage of news alerts. The local financial networks were running the footage of the press conference on a continuous loop. The fallout was instantaneous and utterly catastrophic for Preston. Within an hour, First National Trust completely withdrew his pending loan application and formally submitted his fraudulent collateral documents to the state district attorney for review. Two other major banking institutions immediately froze his corporate accounts, calling in his outstanding high-interest lines of credit. By noon, the massive debt he had accumulated over the years finally collapsed in on him, crushing his firm entirely. His investors initiated an emergency vote to strip him of his chief executive title while the state prepared to indict him on multiple counts of commercial bank fraud. His empire was completely dead. My phone buzzed again, vibrating loudly against the leather armrest. The caller ID flashed the name Patricia. My soon-to-be ex-mother-in-law was undoubtedly watching the news broadcast from the living room of the Oak Cliff mansion, finally realizing that the woman she had spent years degrading was the actual owner of the roof over her head. I tapped the screen to answer, placing the phone on speaker. "Audrey, please." Patricia sobbed, her voice trembling with genuine terror. "You have to stop this. The bank just called to inform us that the mortgage trust is dissolved. They said we have 30 days to vacate the mansion. Where am I supposed to go?" "Audrey, Preston will not answer his phone, and Colin has completely locked himself in the guest bedroom. You cannot throw us out into the street. We are family. You have to show us some mercy." I leaned back against the plush leather seat. My expression remaining entirely neutral, I listened to her desperate crying, feeling absolutely nothing for the woman who had made my life miserable for half a decade. "You stopped being family the moment you helped your son pack my bags." "Patricia," I replied, my tone completely devoid of any warmth. "Do you remember moving day? Do you remember standing in the foyer with your clipboard, meticulously searching through my personal belongings to make sure I was not stealing any of your precious family heirlooms? You told me I had no right to claim anything in that house. I was just protecting." "Preston," Patricia cried desperately, trying to backtrack. "I did not know what he was doing. I did not know the house belonged to you. Please, Audrey, I am an older woman. Let me stay in the guest house. I will pay you rent." "I am not a charity, Patricia," I said, cutting her off sharply, "and I am certainly not a landlord for toxic tenants. You treated me like dirt because you thought I was poor. Now you are begging me for shelter because you realize I hold the deed you have. Exactly 30 days to pack your things. Make sure you only take the clothes you brought into the house. If you attempt to steal any of the imported fixtures or appliances, I will have you arrested for theft. I am setting a permanent boundary right now. Patricia, do not ever contact me again." I ended the call before she could utter another desperate plea and immediately blocked her number from my phone. The severance was final. Across the SUV, Jasmine was sitting comfortably typing rapidly on her digital tablet. She looked up and flashed a brilliant, satisfied smile. Colin just received the finalized delivery notification. Jasmine announced, her dark eyes shining with absolute liberation. I had the process server wait outside the Oak Cliff mansion all morning. The moment the press conference aired and Preston was publicly ruined, the server knocked on the door and handed Colin my official divorce petition. I filed for absolute separation of assets. Since I was the sole breadwinner funding his pathetic lifestyle, he is walking away with absolutely nothing. I raised my glass of sparkling water toward her. Congratulations, Jasmine. You are officially free from the dead weight. Jasmine picked up her own glass and clinked it against mine, the crystal ringing clearly in the quiet vehicle. We both are, Audrey. The entire toxic bloodline has been completely severed. They tried to build their pathetic high society legacy on our backs, and now they are going to learn how to survive at the absolute bottom of the food chain. We drank to our newly claimed freedom, watching the city skyline pass by the tinted windows, knowing we owned it all. 6 months later, the crisp autumn wind swept through the downtown financial district, carrying the golden leaves past the towering glass skyscrapers that I now owned outright. The Crown Plaza was officially under construction, fully funded by Apex Holdings, without a single drop of bank debt. Jasmine had been promoted to my chief operating officer, and together we had expanded the portfolio by another 30%. My life was a seamless operation of high-level executive meetings and quiet luxury. Far away from the sparkling skyline, the reality of my former husband had deteriorated into a bleak existence. Preston woke up to the jarring metallic rattle of a cheap radiator kicking on. His eyes snapped open, and he stared at the water-stained popcorn ceiling of his cramped studio apartment located on the industrial outskirts of the city. The sprawling Oak Cliff mansion with its vaulted ceilings and imported marble columns was nothing more than a painful hallucination. He rubbed his face, feeling the rough stubble he no longer had the energy to shave. He rolled off the lumpy twin mattress, his bare feet hitting the cold, cracked linoleum floor. The luxury sedans, the private drivers, and the valet services were completely gone. He walked over to the chipped Formica kitchen counter and picked up a plastic bus pass, staring at it with absolute resentment. He was $50 million in debt. His corporate reputation was permanently destroyed, and his high society friends had abandoned him the exact second his bank accounts were frozen. He threw on a cheap, wrinkled suit he had bought off the clearance rack at a discount department store. He could not afford dry cleaning. His reflection in the foggy bathroom mirror showed a defeated, aging man. The arrogant swagger that used to define him had been entirely hollowed out. He left his apartment, locking the flimsy wooden door, and walked 3 blocks in the freezing wind to catch the morning bus. The commute took an agonizing 45 minutes, surrounded by exhausted shift workers, a stark contrast to his former life of chauffeured luxury. His destination was a decaying strip mall, situated right next to a noisy interstate highway. The asphalt parking lot was heavily potholed and littered with trash. The faded neon sign above the anchor tenant, a discount liquor store, flickered erratically. Preston pushed open the heavy glass door of the tiny, poorly lit management office, located near the public restrooms. He was no longer the chief executive officer of a premier development firm. He was a low-level leasing agent for a third-tier property management company, a job he had begged for after 42 separate firms rejected his application due to his massive fraud scandal. His new boss, a loud, abrasive man named Carl, was already sitting behind a metal desk eating a greasy breakfast sandwich. "You are late," Preston Carl barked, wiping crumbs off his chin. "The owner of the laundromat in Unit 4 is complaining about a leaking pipe again. Grab the mop bucket from the utility closet and head over there. Tell him we will not call a plumber until he pays his late fees." Preston felt a surge of bile rise in his throat. He wanted to scream. He wanted to flip the metal desk and declare that he was a commercial visionary who used to negotiate half-billion-dollar master leases. But he swallowed his pride, forcing the anger down into the pit of his stomach. He needed the meager hourly wage just to afford instant noodles and cheap coffee. "I will take care of it, Carl." Preston muttered, his voice completely devoid of any fight. He grabbed the filthy yellow mop bucket and dragged it across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. The cold wind whipped his thin suit jacket around him. As he neared the laundromat, he paused, catching his reflection in the dirty storefront window. He looked pathetic. Just a few months ago, he was standing on a televised stage bragging about changing the city skyline. Now he was carrying a mop bucket for a boss who did not even respect him. Preston looked up past the glowing neon signs of the strip mall toward the distant downtown district. A massive digital billboard illuminated the side of a newly completed corporate tower. The advertisement featured a sleek rendering of the Crown Plaza development. At the very bottom of the screen, printed in bold, elegant silver typography, were two words: Apex Holdings. He stood frozen in the freezing wind, gripping the plastic handle of the mop bucket, his knuckles turning white. He had demanded a partner who elevated him. He had ridiculed the quiet woman who balanced his checkbook. He aggressively dug his own grave, trying to bury me deeply. He was ruined. High above the miserable reality of the man who once thought he owned the city, the air was pristine and perfectly still. I stood on the sprawling glass balcony of the newly completed Crown Plaza penthouse, looking out over the glittering downtown skyline. The $500 million development was no longer a dusty dirt lot filled with empty promises and leased construction equipment. It was a towering monument of steel and glass, fully funded by Apex Holdings, and completed months ahead of schedule. We had successfully transformed a toxic illusion into a highly profitable, undeniable physical reality here tonight. Jasmine stepped out onto the terrace, her heels clicking softly against the imported porcelain tiles. She handed me a crystal flute filled with vintage champagne, her dark eyes reflecting the vibrant city lights below us. She was wearing a stunning sapphire evening gown, looking completely unbothered and fiercely powerful. As the newly appointed chief operating officer of my empire, she had personally overseen the final leasing agreements for the commercial floors below us. The entire building was fully occupied by elite corporate tenants, generating massive continuous revenue, without a single cent of toxic bank debt holding us down right now. "It is hard to believe we pulled this off so quickly," Jasmine said, taking a slow sip of her champagne and leaning gracefully against the thick glass railing. "When I look back at that disastrous engagement party at the Oak Cliff mansion, it feels like a completely different lifetime." Colin tried to call my office again yesterday to beg for a temporary financial loan. I instructed my receptionist to permanently block his toxic number. It is incredibly refreshing to wake up every single morning and know that my energy is finally being invested entirely into my own limitless potential here today. I smiled, feeling the cool evening breeze brush against my face. "I completely agree with you, Jasmine. For 5 long years, I purposely dimmed my own light to make a remarkably insecure man feel like the absolute center of the universe. I wore cheap cardigans, managed mundane receipts, and endured relentless insults from a family that was entirely funded by my silent labor. They mistook my strategic patience for weakness. They genuinely believed that absolute silence equated to absolute compliance. They never realized that a quiet woman is usually just a woman who is incredibly busy building her massive kingdom." Jasmine laughed, a rich and melodic sound that echoed perfectly across the private luxury balcony. We raised our crystal flutes high into the cool autumn air. "To our absolute freedom," Jasmine declared proudly, "and to the undeniable power of sisterhood." We gently clinked our glasses together, the sharp ring symbolizing the complete severing of our past chains. We drank the expensive champagne, basking in the glow of the massive empire we had successfully secured and expanded. We were no longer just surviving in a ruthless corporate world dominated by arrogant men. We were actively rewriting all the established rules tonight. I turned my back to the sweeping city skyline and looked directly forward, breaking the invisible barrier to address you directly. My voice was calm, steady, and filled with the hard-earned wisdom of a woman who had successfully navigated the absolute lowest depths of betrayal to secure the highest peak of total victory. Protecting your peace often requires allowing foolish people to aggressively underestimate your intelligence. It requires immense emotional discipline to smile politely while someone insults your ambition, knowing full well that you hold the legal deed to the very ground they are proudly standing on right now. True power does not need to loudly announce itself at pretentious engagement parties or desperate press conferences. True power simply executes the final contract and changes the locks when the timing is absolutely perfect. I want to hear your personal experiences. Let us build a strong community of brilliant strategists who know exactly how to secure their own futures. If you enjoyed watching this arrogant empire crumble and want to see more stories of absolute calculated payback, make sure you hit that like button. Thank you for watching my long journey to become the undisputed owner of this beautiful city. Sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is let an arrogant man believe he's winning right up until he realizes he's playing on her board. Have you ever had to let someone underestimate you to protect your peace? Share your story in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a single episode. Stay powerful, stay silent, and always remember to carefully read the fine print before you sign your precious future away. I will certainly see you all in the very next exciting video quite soon. Goodbye.